Are you a PA or an NP who is thinking about leaving your job? Well, if so, you need to know that it's not just about giving notice. You have to navigate legal and patient responsibilities, as well as protecting your reputation in the medical community. How you handle your exit can impact your career for years to come. Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm a practicing PA, and in this video, I'll walk you through the essential steps for a smooth transition, including what information you need to gather and take with you and what to do if you can't or don't want to work out your full notice. Okay, well, first, let's talk about giving notice. Most of us have contracts that say we're required to give 30, 60, or even 90 days notice. But here's the catch. Once you give that notice, your employer doesn't always keep you around for that full period. It's not fair. I mean, it really is awful, the things that happen to us providers, I know, but I have seen countless posts from providers who give their 3 months notice, they do what is right, and then their employer is like, thanks, but see ya. Your next day is tomorrow, or your last day is tomorrow, or maybe even your last day is next week. And that can leave you in a really tough financial spot, especially since it takes us months to get credentialed and actually start working in a new role. So, what should you do in this situation? Well, first, you always go to your contract. Read your contract carefully. Know exactly what your obligations are, but also what your employer's obligations are. Sometimes, when it comes to the notice, the contract will specify the notice that both parties have to give. But sometimes it doesn't say anything out at all about the employer and just says what we have to do. So pay careful attention to the clause in the contract about separation and be prepared to push back if your employer is also legally obligated to a notice, but they try to let go of you early. Now, if it doesn't say anything about the employer's responsibility here, or if the wording is very vague, which they probably do on purpose, you should probably prepare for the possibility that you may be let go early. Secondly, you should plan ahead financially. I know it's not always easy, but if you're thinking about leaving, then start cutting back on your expenses and save up some money. Even just having money on hand to cover a month or two of expenses can give you a little breathing room. Another tip is to line up your next role as soon as you can, before you give notice. And I get it, we don't always have the luxury of perfect timing, but being well into the application and interview process at least can shorten that gap a little bit. Of course, if you can afford it financially, sometimes it's really nice to take a little break between jobs. Have a little mini sabbatical, spend quality time with family, travel, dive into a hobby, just generally refresh before you start working again. Now, here's something else that I also recommend to colleagues who are worried about the financial strain of being cut loose early. Consider locums, either local, especially if you live in a larger city or state, or even do traveling locums. If you already hold the state license, locums companies can sometimes get you into a position really quick, sometimes as quick as a couple of days. And that can be a great way to help bridge the gap between jobs. And it's not forever. If you don't like it, it's just a safety net. It's just an option to think about. Now, same thing with PRN shifts. If you already have been credentialed somewhere else as a PRN employee, even if you don't really pick up shifts that often, go to them and see if they have anything available, like if they can use you a lot more, maybe even full time over the next couple of months. Having those options in your back pocket takes a lot of stress out of or a lot of the fear away from the what if scenario of being let go early. But what if you're in a really toxic environment and you don't know if you can or should work out your notice? Maybe you're being asked to practice in ways that feel unethical or that you feel could put your license in jeopardy. Or maybe the environment just sucks so bad that you can't even imagine working out a 3 months notice. Well, here's the reality. You always want to follow your contract if you can, but you also have to protect yourself, your mental well-being, and your license. Sometimes leaving a job without working the full notice turns out to be no big deal, and the employer doesn't do anything about it. However, you need to know that there can be repercussions. It can be considered a breach of contract, which could lead to a lawsuit from your employer for damages, which could include the cost of hiring a temporary replacement. And that could be a significant amount. And depending on how spiteful your employer is, it could also lead to a claim of patient abandonment, which can harm your professional reputation and jeopardize your license. So, really, the best course of action here, if you cannot work out your full notice for whatever reason, is to try and negotiate an exit strategy with your employer. Give some, take some, ask about maybe using some accrued PTO in combination with working days. It's really up to your employer's discretion and in policies, but if you handle it professionally, there's potentially a way that you can get out of the contract earlier. Of course, you also could consider consulting with an employment attorney to understand your options before you give notice or start that negotiation. Also, when you're leaving a toxic job, I recommend documenting your concerns in writing, even if it's just for your own records. That way, if anyone questions why you left sooner than your notice required, you have a clear record of your reasoning. And if there are emails or any kind of written documentation that back up why you're leaving or that demonstrate the toxic or unsafe nature of the work environment, be sure to forward those to a non-work email so you can access them in the future. And by the way, if you're finding this video helpful, be sure to check out my full career series. The playlist is linked below. It covers everything from knowing when it's time to leave a job to finding massive success in a new one. Okay, now let's talk about other legal things that you need to pay attention to beyond the notice period. You want to check your contract regarding any repayment obligations. We may not even think about this, but did you get a sign-on bonus or a relocation allowance or a quarterly bonus that has to be repaid if you leave within a certain time frame? What about PTO that you've used or CME money that may need to be repaid by the policy if you didn't complete the full year of working? Make sure you understand any financial obligations you may have before you give notice. And one last note about PTO. Some states like California do consider accrued PTO as earned wages, and by law, they must be paid to you upon termination. So be sure to check your state laws and don't leave this money on the table if it's legally yours. Now let's talk about one of the big ones, non-compete clauses. These are clauses that may restrict you from practicing within a certain area or a certain specialty for a specified time period after leaving your job. I know that's been thrown around a lot out there on social media that it's now illegal for companies to have non-compete clauses, but that's not necessarily true. It really depends on the state you're in. Yes, some states have banned them, but there are stipulations and requirements that have to be met in order for it to legally be banned. So if you're in one of those states, don't just assume that your non-compete is irrelevant or is no longer legal. My advice is if you think your non-compete could affect your next move, like if you're not moving out of state or somewhere where it's not going to affect you, then it's worth talking with an employment attorney in your state to understand your options and what the state enforces. It doesn't have to be really expensive to get a legal opinion. You may even be able to get that information you need during a free consult. Another really important piece to think about is malpractice insurance. Find out if your employer's coverage is occurrence-based or claims-made and whether you'll need tail coverage when you leave. And here's a tip that I wish more people knew or thought about is always ask HR for a copy of your certificate of insurance, also called your COI. This little piece of paper proves you were covered, shows your liability limits, and gives you the name and phone number of the malpractice insurer. That way, if questions ever come up later, you'll know exactly who to call instead of scrambling years down the road trying to figure it out. Plus, your next employer may require a copy of it during credentialing. Now, if you're not really sure how malpractice insurance works and what tail means and all of that stuff, then watch this video here. Now let's talk about how you resign, because the way you leave really says a lot about you as a professional. First off, do it in person if possible, but then make sure you follow it up with a written resignation letter via email so you have documented proof of your resignation date. Be clear, be concise, and keep it professional. And when you're leaving, don't badmouth your employer or your colleagues, even if the environment was toxic and horrible. Resist the urge to vent on the way out. Healthcare is a small world, especially in the same city or health system, and you never know whose path you're going to cross again in the future. Another key point to think about is patient care. Make sure you're tying up loose ends, completing charts, handling outstanding prescriptions, and ensuring a smooth handoff. Ethically, our patients do come first, even as we're transitioning. And don't forget about confidentiality. HIPAA still applies. You can't take patient lists or proprietary materials with you. That can get you into some serious legal trouble and damage your reputation. Now, here is another very important tip. Before your last day, make sure you gather copies of anything important from your records. These would be things like performance evaluations, procedure logs, credentialing documents, and any certifications you got from your employer while you were working there. These can be difficult or impossible to get later. Save yourself a lot of trouble. Do it now. Also, double check what your final paycheck will include. Ask about that unused PTO. Ask about benefits continuation like COBRA. And if you can, secure contact information and or letters of recommendation before you leave. It's so much easier to get that done now when you can talk to your colleagues face to face. If you're already thinking about your next move and you're getting excited, but maybe you're wondering, how do I know my next job will be any better than this one that I'm leaving? Well, don't leave that up to chance. There are things that you can do. So watch this video here. It will help you figure out what your must-haves and your deal breakers are before you start job hunting so you can actually find a job that's a perfect fit for you.